guys, welcome to your ecology video notes, part 1. This is going to focus primarily on organisms and their relationships with the environment. The second part is going to focus a lot on the different cycles. So let's get started with biomes. You've already studied biomes quite a bit in middle school, so we're really just going to kind of brief over a few of the things, and then you'll do an activity in class to go over them further. So biomes are classified according to temperature, precipitation, and plant species. So these are the three things that affect the biomes, and if you look at this map here, this shows all the different biomes and how they're distributed across the globe. When we talk about biomes, we also need to talk about the levels of organization within those biomes. So as you move from organism here to biosphere, you're having an increase in the amount of interactions between organisms. So obviously a single organism, if you're just looking at that, doesn't have any interactions, whereas a biosphere has tons of organisms and their interactions. Let's take a look at some of these definitions then. So an organism itself is just that, an individual. And if you look at this picture over here, we'll start with a small circle and get larger. A population then is organisms of the same species that share the same area, like this population of fish. A community then becomes the interacting population. So these are all of your living things, your plant and animal and other things that live in this area that are interacting. The ecosystem itself is where the abiotic factors come in. Things like amount of sunlight, rainfall, temperature. All of those things are going to affect the ecosystem. And then lastly, we have biome. So biome is a bunch of similar ecosystems that have the same types of qualities that make them into a single biome, like saltwater or tundra or desert. So those are all going to be biomes. And then of course, all the biomes together make the biosphere. So let's talk about the factors then. Biotic factors are just that, living, bio, living. They're components of that ecosystem that are alive, like producers, consumers, decomposers. All of these organisms contribute to the biotic factors. Abiotic factors, on the other hand, are those non-living parts. Things like temperature, sunlight, if you're in the ocean, tides and wave action. And then, unfortunately, due to us humans, pollution is also an abiotic factor. When we talk about our ecosystems, we also have some limiting factors. So these are things that put a restriction on the population and how large it can get based on whether it's the population or not. So first of all, a density independent factor. Independent is just that. It does not depend on the population size. So a tornado, for example, doesn't target the forest that has the highest deer population. It's just going to hit wherever it hits, and species are affected as a result. Density dependent factors, on the other hand, do depend on the population size, and it's typically larger. So the larger a population is, the more competition you have for resources, the more likely you are to have diseases spread between that population, and also things like parasites. When we talk about interactions, there's two other words that you need to be familiar with, and these are habitat and niche. So these are very commonly messed up, but habitat is something you're probably a little more familiar with. So this is just simply the area where an organism lives. Or it's easy to think about it as your address. The niche, on the other hand, is the role you have in your environment. So this is kind of like your job. So if we look at this picture down here, we see a spruce tree, right? Well, there's 3 different warblers, which you could say that a spruce tree is their habitat, right? But if you notice, they all occupy different parts of the tree. So this would be their niche, or the role they have within that environment or that tree. There's also community interactions. So competition and predation are terms you're probably pretty familiar with. Competition is just more than one organism uses a resource at the same time. So there might be competition, say, for media center passes. You want that resource, but you're competing with other people for it. Predation, on the other hand, is when one species gets its food from eating another species, like this praying mantis you see here. So this would be a totally different interaction. There's also some ways to avoid this predation, right? So things like camouflage. If we look, you see this owl hiding here in this tree. So it's a prey defense to either avoid being eaten or, in his case, probably to hide. That way he can better sneak attack his prey. There's also two versions of mimicry that you need to be aware of. The first is Batesian mimicry. So one species that's not venomous, like this scarlet king snake here, is going to mimic a species that is venomous. Now, as humans, we look at that picture and you're like, ooh, okay, like I can definitely see some differences. But if you're in the wild and you know that snakes are a predator and you see a snake that's red, black, and yellow, chances are you're not going to mess with it because it's probably venomous, right? Same concept. Another type of mimicry is Müllerian mimicry. So this is when two undesirable species, so that you don't want anything to do with either one of them, but they mimic each other. So if you look here, there's two different types of bees, a cuckoo bee and a yellow jacket, and they both look pretty menacing. You're probably not going to go near either one of them, and with good reason, right? They're both undesirable. So we also need to talk about relationships. Now, symbiosis is a close relationship between two species that live together. And there's three major types that you need to be aware of. Before we go over these, I do want you to remember that predation is not a type of symbiotic relationship, although people commonly think that. In a relationship, you don't want the other thing to die, whereas in predation, somebody's going to die. So think about that as we go over these definitions. So the first you need to know is mutualism, and this is just that. You're mutual, you both benefit from your relationship. Commensalism is where one species benefits and the other's like, I mean, you're not really annoying me, but you're not really doing anything for me, so I guess you can stay. And then parasitism, this is the one most people are familiar with. This is where one benefits and the other is harmed, also known as the host. So if you've ever had fleas on your dog or your cat, the flea was the parasite and your dog or cat was the host. Now that we've established relationships, let's just talk about the different types of organisms. So the first major difference is producers versus consumers. So an autotroph, or producer, gets its energy from the sun or other inorganic substances to produce their own food, hence producer. And also think auto is self, so self-feeding. Heterotroph, on the other hand, is a consumer, and these organisms get energy from consuming other organisms. Now let's go a little further into the types of heterotrophs. So herbivore eats plants, like our giraffe over here to the right. Carnivore eats meat, or in some cases scavenges, like a vulture. If you've ever seen vultures up high, they're looking for like rotten meat, but they're still a carnivore. Omnivores eat both, like our chickens. They're going to eat plant and insects and different animal matter. A decomposer, like this fungi over here on this dead tree, is going to break down organic matter. And then a term that might be new to you is a detritivore. These organisms are here, and they're going to eat decomposing plant, animal, or fecal matter. So there might already be decomposers on these organisms, breaking them down, and then the detritivore kind of comes in and starts eating those different substances. Now we're going to get into how energy flows between these organisms. So before we get into the specifics, we need to talk about trophic levels. So these are the different steps in a food chain or a food pyramid or even a food web that you're going to hear a lot. So the first would be a producer. Second, primary consumers. These are your herbivores. They eat the producers. Third level is your secondary consumers, or typically your omnivores. They're going to eat the plant matter, but they also might eat other small animals. Tertiary consumers are your carnivores. They eat your omnivores typically. And then something that's not pictured but would be up here would be your top consumers or your apex predators, or another word would be quaternary consumers. So let's first talk about a food chain. So this is just a simple model that shows how energy flows through an ecosystem. Like we said, producer to herbivore to omnivore to carnivore, but don't forget about those decomposers. And if this was a realistic food web, it would technically, or food chain, sorry, it would technically have an arrow from every organism pointing to the decomposers, because not every snake's going to get eaten by a hawk. There's going to be snakes that die, and then the decomposers will break down their bodies. A food web is just many interconnected food chains. So if you look at this food web here, and you might want to pause it, you can go through and kind of trace all the different food chains that exist within that web. An energy pyramid is just a little bit more advanced food chain, but it's also showing the biomass and how energy moves throughout the different levels and how much is available. So if you notice, the producers are at the bottom and there's the most amount of them, whereas your tertiary consumers are at the top and there's typically not that many of them in a population. So something else you need to be aware of is the 10% rule. So as you move up the food pyramid, 90% of your available energy is lost. That means only 10% is transferring. So if we look at that in terms of a biomass amount, if you start with 20,000 kilocalories here with your producers, you're going to go down by a power of 10 as you move up the food web or food chain. This is why there's not a lot of top predators, but there's tons of producers in any given environment. Another thing you need to be aware of is ecological succession. So this is just the change of a new community due to either abiotic or biotic factors that are changing. And there's two types, primary, secondary. We'll come back to this picture and figure out what kind it is. But first, primary. So this is the gradual growth of an ecosystem where there has never been one before. We start out with bare rock, and you go all the way to your climax tree community. Your secondary succession typically started with a climax community that was destroyed, maybe by fire or a tornado or a flood, and then everything has to start all over again to get to that climax. So if we go back to our image, you'll see it was a stable forest, then there was a disturbance, so this picture is an example of a secondary succession. We also need to talk about then how the population grows. So there are two different population growth models. There's exponential and logistic. What kind do you think humans are? Well, have we reached a carrying capacity? Nope. We are exponential. So the growth rate is just simply proportional to the size of your population. The logistic growth, on the other hand, which is much more common in nature, is when the growth rate begins to decrease when a population reaches carrying capacity. Well, what's carrying capacity? That is just simply the maximum number that can be supported in the environment, but the key here is long term. So it's limited by things like the amount of energy available. Think back to that food pyramid. How much water is there? How much oxygen, nutrients available? Those are all going to affect the carrying capacity of any given population. We also need to discuss the different types of strategists then based on that carrying capacity. So our strategists are adapted to living in those unstable environments. So these are generally small organisms like this rat you see here. They have a very short lifespan and they produce many offspring. A K strategist, on the other hand, is used to living in that stable environment, and it's generally a larger organism, something like this elephant you see, with a long lifespan and producing few offspring. So we would also qualify here as a K strategist. And that is all for your notes.